Hello everyone, this is Joshua Haji, Software Engineer Supervisor here at Pixelate, and I'm here to talk to you about Vue Js. So how have you been, guys? Been learning well so far? Have you been learning how to use Vue? Let us know in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to like and share our video. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tutorials and videos. So, let's begin. In this video, we're going to talk about components, Vuex, and Vue Router. For now, we're going to tackle components first. Later on, we'll talk about Vuex and Vue Router. Let's begin. What are components? Components are basically reusable Vue instances with a name. Also, components can be used as a custom element, as well as data can be passed to and from components. How do you use components? Here you can see that we have a typical template in the script tag. So first step would be to import our component to be used within another component. In this case, we have a child component. Next is we register that component as a child component. As you can see, I've declared the components object here and passed our imported component inside that. Next, we need to render that component inside the template tag. As you can see, we have the child component right here. Basically, that's how you use components inside a Vue file. So how do you pass data between components? We have two ways to do that. First is props and the other is emit. So what's the difference? Props basically allows the passing of data from the parent component to the child component, whereas emit allows the passing of data from the child parent back to the parent component. Also, data can only be passed from one component at a time. Later on, we'll show you why is that. So, in this case, we have props. Here, you can see our parent component. And in this case, you can see our child component. Let's start with the parent component first. As mentioned earlier, we have step 1 right here. Next, we have step 2 right here. And finally, we have step 3 right here. Now, how do we pass data to the child component? We use this one, meaning we have a message property attached to the component. So what do we do with this one? Basically, since it is a property, we need to attach data to it. So in this case, the message, which is this one, which is just a string. Next, we go to our child component. As you can see, a message is rendered to our child component. Now, where does this message come from? It comes from this props element here. As you can see, it is an array which contains message. So what does this message mean? This message is basically this message in the child component rendered to the parent. So that means whatever your content here, which is in this case a string, gets passed along to here and then through here and then gets passed as a prop to the child. So you can expect that the message value here is similar to this one. Whenever the parent data changes, the child re-renders itself. That way you can transfer data from the parent back to the child. So how do you do the opposite, meaning from the child back to the parent? In this case, we use emit. Trigger an emit, we need to trigger an event. In this case, we can use a click event, which fires a sendback method. You can see that the sendback method is below here. What it does is it fires an emit, as you can see here. The first parameter would be the event name. In this case, we are emitting a pass message event. Value here can be anything you can think of as long as it is in camel case, meaning the first letter is small and the preceding letter of the word is big. The next parameter would be the value you want to pass back parent. In this case, you can see that the parent component is waiting for a pass message event right here. So once the pass message event gets triggered to the child component, the parent component shall fire this function right here, which is a method for the parent. Also, you will notice that there is a message property here. What does this mean? Basically, when this event fires, you can see that we are passing a value right here, right, in the child component. So in the parent component, the pass message event contains the message. So that message gets passed to the method right here. In turn, you can expect that the method we have in our parent will contain the message passed by the child component. So all we have to do is to show that the message from the child gets passed to the parent. In this case, we used an alert. That is how you transfer data to and from components. As mentioned earlier, we mentioned that passing data through deeply nested components is tedious. Why is that so? Because the data from this component down here cannot be passed directly to the top level one here. How does it happen? Basically, from here, it has to go to here before it reaches the top level. If you have a deeply nested component system, or rather a structure of components which are rooted deeply, that is quite hassle. So how do you deal with that? You deal with that using Vuex. Now you might ask, what is Vuex? Vuex is basically a state management pattern and a library. Also, Vuex is a centralized store for all components. Also, to maintain its integrity, Vuex has rules ensuring that the state can only be mutated in a predictable fashion. Lastly, Vuex is used building large-scale single-page applications. So here we have an example diagram how Vuex works. Vuex is basically this dotted green line right here. So let's start from our component. So from our component, we fire a dispatch which triggers actions inside our Vuex, which in turn fires a commit which will trigger mutations. Now, what are mutations? Mutations are the only way to change the state. In this case, you can see that the mutations mutate the state. In turn, the state, whatever it may contain, gets rendered back to our components. So as you can see, it is a continuous cycle of data change. Now, why is this important? Later on, we'll see why. So for now, let's talk about the core concepts of Vuex, which is the state, getters, mutations, actions, and modules. So let's start with state. State is basically tree. You can imagine that the state is some sort of a root of a tree. So you can imagine it has lots of branches going down. So basically Vuex is akin to that, in a sense that Vuex only has a single object which contains all application level state, meaning everything your app might need in form of data can be found inside your state. Also, it serves as a single source of truth. That means that your data is not transferred anywhere else except the state itself. So you can always find your data right here in the state. Also, to maintain its integrity, Vuex follows the same rules as the data in a Vue instance. So whatever the behavior of a data instance in a Vue component, Vuex also behaves similarly to that. So you can expect that state is basically reactive. Next, we have getters. So what are getters? Getters are considered as computed properties of stores. What do you mean by that? In a computed property, it is a running function, right? So have a computed property that continually evaluates upon data change and renders accordingly based on the return, since it is a function, right? So you can expect that getters work similar to that, in a sense that you can bind getters to components directly. So whenever your state changes, getters fetches those values and then continuously renders them the components itself. Also, the good thing about getters is that results are cached based on its dependencies, meaning we can save data that and processing power. Also, getters will only reevaluate when some of its dependencies have changed. What do we mean by that? Since we know that for every DOM re-render the function runs, in the case of getters, if the value stays the same, the function will not run itself anymore and rather return the same value it has evaluated previously. That way, we can save processing power, which is crucial for other types of applications, which has limited processing capabilities. So next would be mutations. So mutations are the only way actually change the state in a Vuex store. Also, mutations are very similar to events, wherein each mutation has a string type and a handler. Later on, we'll show you how it looks. Also, the handler is basically a function wherein the actual state modifications are performed. Like I showed earlier in the video, you can see in the diagram that the only way to access the state is via mutations. So the one responsible for that is the handler function. Also, handler function receives state as the first argument. Next, we have actions. Actions are similar to mutations with key differences. Actions commit mutations instead of mutating the state. Do you see the difference? Actions commit mutations rather than mutating the state. Why is that so? It's because actions can contain arbitrary asynchronous operations. So for those of you familiar with JavaScript, JavaScript is an asynchronous language, meaning your code basically runs down continuously without waiting for a return value from a function. That's what we mean by asynchronous. So in the JavaScript world, that is a powerful tool helping us build responsive interfaces. Also, mutations have to be synchronous, meaning it goes down continuously, while actions does not have to be, meaning it can stray away from the main flow from time to time, making it much faster than mutations. Next, we have modules. Modules basically allows you to divide stores into modules, wherein each module can contain its own state, mutations, actions, and getters. Later on, when your store gets way too big already, you need to separate them via modules. That makes your store more clean looking and more easier to maintain. So here we have a sample Vuex store. As you can see, we have state right here, which contains a to-do list array. As mentioned earlier, state behaves similarly to a data function. As you can see, they are completely the same. Also, here you will see our getters. Getters contains our to-do list. What does this to-do list do? Basically, it is a function which contains our state, which can run certain functions. In this case, what the getters does is simply to return what our state contains, which is the to-do list, this one. So here, you can see our mutations. For now, we have two mutations, the add and the remove. You will notice that the add to do item contains a state and a value. The state is basically this one, while the value is the value passed to the mutation itself. So what do we do with the mutation? Basically, we manipulate our state inside mutations. As you can see, we have a push here and a splice. We can add and remove values from our to-do list right here. So in this side, you can see actions. Now, as mentioned earlier, actions can contain asynchronous code, right? And actions commit mutations. So here you can see we have two actions, the add item and remove item. And we have values attached to them, meaning parameters. Also, you will see a context here. What does this mean? Context is basically your current store. What do you mean by that? In this context, inside this variable are your state, your getters, and your mutations. If you want to use the state, you can access it using the context right here. In this case, you can see that we are committing within the context. So when we call context.commit, we are pertaining to the mutations we have right here. In this case, we're asking the add to do item, which is this one, to push an item, which is right here. Now, this item is basically this item above here, which is a parameter for the components to pass values. This works in the same way as the remove item below here. There you go. That is what a typical Vuex store like. But later on, you will ask, how do we change components? We can't stay in a single component all the time, right? Sooner or later, we'll have to change components. So how do we do that? We have Vue Router. So what is Vue Router? Vue Router is a routing mechanism for switching components. What do you mean by that? Basically, it is a way for the Vue application itself to change components based on a given URL path. Later on, we'll show you what exactly a URL path looks like. Also, Vue Router is used in building single-page applications, which is useful for changing components using URL paths. So here, you can see that we have a typical Vue Router. First, you'll notice that we have a routes array here. First, you will notice as well that we have objects right here. These are our determined routes. So we have a route which leads to a path, which is just a slash, which basically translates to our URL right here, and a to-do list path, which roughly translates to this URL right here. You will also notice that we have a component, meaning when our URL is Similar to this one, this component gets triggered. When our URL is something like this one, this component gets triggered. So that is how Vue Router changes components based on URL paths. How does it work? In order to make it work, first we need to add a router link. It is basically a link that tells Vue where to go next. As you can see here, we have two links, one for home, another for a to-do component. You will notice as well that they have both paths, which are unique. Whenever you click these links, the route is updated by clicking on the link. Also, whatever the component is attached with this path, it gets rendered inside this router view. You click the home, the component attached to this path gets rendered inside this element. The same goes for this one. It gets rendered inside this component as well. So aside from that, we also have dynamic routes. Dynamic routes are useful for components which depends on certain parameters before rendering, and it allows the passing of values in between routes. How does that work? So here we have an example which is our to-do list path earlier, but this time you will notice a dynamic binding here. This dynamic binding is considered a dynamic route. What do you mean by that? In this example, if you attach a number 1 right here to your URL, when you go to your to-do component, that number 1 is passed as well. So here, you will see our to-do component, wherein the route is accessed and the parameters is accessed, wherein you can find the ID itself. Here, as you can see, we have declared an ID. So in order to access our parameter here, whatever this may contain, we use this ID in our component, which is this one. In case you change this ID to something else, simply use that value as your parameter here. So since we passed a 1 here, the parameters over here gets passed the value of 1 as well. That is how we transfer data between routes, which is very useful for special cases like RESTful APIs. So also, there are cases where we cannot change components based on user interaction. Rather, we have instances where we cannot change components using event from the user. So one use case would be we need to change our path using a function or rather a method, or we need some dynamic parameters, or maybe a specific route needs to be navigated after a certain process occurs. For those use cases, we have programmatic navigation for that. How does it work? Basically, programmatic navigation is a way for us to change routes whenever we want to. In this case, we have a function right here, navigate, right? So when you click the button here, which fires the navigate method then pushes a new route to it. So you can see that using the push method, we are telling our router to change path. So whatever path we put here must be the same as the path declared in routes. Otherwise, you will get thrown a 404 error, meaning your component is not found. So in order to show you guys how it works, here we have a sample Vue Js app. In order to demonstrate, let's start with the component first. Here is our code for our example app here. First, in order to set up our project, we need to open a terminal. Then, we need to head over our directory. In my case, I pasted it here, in this specific directory. Next, what we need to do is, if Vue installed, we need to install Vuex. We do so by typing npm space install space Vuex, and then we press enter. Now, when you press enter, you will see that it will install Vuex. In my case, it is already installed. Next, once that Vuex is installed, we need to install Vue Router, and then we press enter. Both of their installations look quite the same. Now, once they are both installed, you can now close that one, and then we run our typical npm run serve command, which is, as you can see, this command right here. Once we run that, our application gets hosted in a localhost server. Once it is up and running, you will see our typical Vue Js app right here. Now that we have our application, we can start creating components. First, we need to create our own component first. Since in our topic earlier, we used a parent and child component, this time we'll create those as well. So first, we create a parent component first. We have parent component. Next, once our parent component is there, we need to add a child component. Now that we have two components, we'll add a simple HTML here. Let's try I am a parent component right there. Oh, this is the child component. Rather, we use this here, the div here, right there. The child, we will have a child component like that. Next, we need to add our child component to our parent component here. First, we need to import that child component. And then after importing that child component, we add a components object, which will contain our child component. After we declare our child component here, we render it as a component here, as an element rather. Now, our parent component renders the child component below it. Next, our child component, we will do nothing for now. But we need to see how it works in real time, rather in real life application. So first, we have our main.js app here, right? And here is our application itself. So we need to override the hello world with our own component. We'll place here parent component and then remove our old component, which is hello world. Hit save, and then we remove this one. Once it is saved, you can see that our component has not yet changed, right? You need to try refreshing the page first. There you go, right there. Sorry for the minor inconvenience. So as you can see, we have the parent component here, which is this one, which is rendering the child component here. That is how you render components. So how do we pass data from the parent to the child? We do so by using props. So first, we need to declare a data block here. And then we create a value wherein we will attach it to the component. In this case, let's use message, which contains string. Next, we will get this data value here and then attach it as a props here. Now that we are passing a props to the child must parse it. How does it do that? We use the props component. So we head to our child and then we attach a props, which is an array containing the names of the props, which is message. Next, we render it to our child component similarly like so. So you can see the hello gets rendered to the child component. But the important part here is the hello value comes from the parent, which is right here. Gets passed to the message, which is this one, and then gets passed as a props to the child named message. So once we reach the child, we declared a props with the name message. So this message contains this value. So now that we have that, next is we need to pass value to the parent using the child. So how do we do that? Basically, we need to create first an event here in our child. As you can see, we have a button here which fires a send event function. In turn, it creates an emit right here, like so. So what does this mean? When we click the send event here, it fires this method, which in turn will fire this emit, passing on this event and this value. Back to our parent component, we have that pass message here as an event. Next, we have the parse child message here. This basically is our method right here, which in turn will tell us that the child component says hi, which is this one. When we try it, you'll see that it shows that. Basically, that's how we pass values from the child back parent. Next, talk about Vuex. How do we use Vuex? Since we have this current project right here, let's use this as our playground. First, we need to create a folder, the name store. Next, we'll have to add a file, namely index.js. So what does this file contains? Basically, import Vue here and we import Vuex here as well. Next, we tell Vue to use the Vuex. Now we know that the Vue app is using Vuex. Next, we need to declare our own store. Let's declare a store. So right now we have an empty store, and then we export that store as a default value. That's how you create a Vuex store. Next, we'll need to attach it to our application. So we head over to main, and then we import that store. Once we import that store, we need to attach it to our Vue instance right here, like so. Once it is attached, when we go to our application, you'll see that nothing has changed yet. That's because we simply created a store for our application, but we're not showing anything yet. First, we need to declare state. So our current state would be, we'll create a array which is named to-do list, like so, and then we'll add something to it. Say, let's add something. There you go. Now we have our state. How do we display that state to our component? We'll make use of getters. So in order to do that, we will create our getters named to-do list. So what does this do is it basically returns the content of state. So we have state.to-do list. What we did here is that we declared a to-do list getter with state, which is this one, as its parameter. And we return the state, which is this one, and then the to-do list, which is this one. Now we have state and getters. So back to our child component. Let's say we want to render our to-do list. So in order to do that, we simply need to create a for loop here. Let's make div element for now. Then let's create an unordered list, and then let's create item. So, and then attach a v4. So let's use value in get, let's say to-do list. And then let's attach a key to it, which is index. So attach the index over here. So, and then let's display the 10. So next, we will need to declare a computed property. Since getters work similarly to computed properties, we will declare here our getters. How do we do that? We need to apply this specific syntax. So what does this syntax do? Basically, what it does is it binds all your getters to your component. So how do you do that? We have a to-do list getter here, so we grab this one and then we attach that here. As you can see, it is highlighted as red because we need to import that specific functionality from Vuex, like so. Map getters is a function of Vuex which allows us to bind our getters to our components for easy access. Next, as you can see, there it is. Our to-do list getter, which is this one, is bound to our computed property, which in turn gets bound to our element here. Meaning, our to-do list is directly from the store itself, which is the state over here. Now that we are able to fetch our data, we can see that if we add another object here, the DOM gets updated as well because they are reactive and they act similarly to a computed property. Now, how do we mutate our state? So first, in order to do that, we need to create mutations. For now, let's create add to-do list, which is a function which contains the state and the value we need to add. What we will do is we will use the state and then grab the to-do list and then push a value to it, the key of value, and then attach the value itself. What we did here is we created a mutation named add to-do list with state, which is this one as its parameter, and value, which will be passed as an argument. Next, what we did is we used the state, which is this one, and then we accessed to-do list, which is this one, and then we will push a value to it, meaning an object with a key named value, which is similar to this one, and then we assign the value, which is the argument on. How do we use this mutation? First, we go to our child component, and then in order for us to be able to add a mutation, we need to create a form of input. So let's create an input right here. So we have this simple input, and then let's add a button to it, wherein we will trigger the event which will handle the mutation. Add item, add. That should suffice. Next, we will add this as a data. We'll create a data block below here, and then we attach that input value with right here. For now, it is an empty string, meaning it has nothing. And then we grab this add item and we set it as a method. Now, what we will do in this method is to access the store, which is this one, this Vuex store, using this store command, and then we will commit. Now, what does commit mean? Commit is a syntax used to access our mutations. The first parameter of a commit is the commit name, which is this one. So we grab this one, and then we paste it here. And then the second value would be the payload, what we will pass to that mutation. In this case, what we will pass is our input value. So let's type this value. Now that it's complete, we can try using it. If we add something here and then click add, it will add something to our list. So what we did is we mutated our state using our components via mutations. Now, how do we use actions? Actions are basically functions that commit mutations, right? So what we will do first is to create an action here. Let's declare an action, and then let's name it add item. Take note that mutations and actions must be different in their names, because if we do not do that, they will collide with each other, which is bad, right? So now that we have an add item here, what we will do is we will add a context as the first parameter, and then the value, which is the second parameter. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the context, which is basically this entire store, and then access our commit, which is mutations over here. So what are we going to commit? Going to commit this mutation here, and then we're going to pass the value, which is right here. What we did is created an action that contains a parameter value, wherein this function right here is going to commit, which is this one, this specific mutation, which is this one, and then pass this value to this mutation, which is this one. Does that make sense so far? What we did is basically we created an action which will commit a mutation, which in turn will modify the state. Since we have a getters here which is reactive to this to-do list, whatever the content of our to-do list here gets updated in our map getters here, therefore changing our content here, right? That's how Vuex basic works. So next, in order to fire that action, we will replace this commit with a dispatch. Now, what is dispatch? Dispatch is used to call actions. So once we save that, then we try again. Click add. Yes, I forgot. We grab this action name and then we use it here. Something. There you go. That is how we use actions in the context of a component. Now, since we have a complete store, which is this one, now how do we use Vue Router to switch between components? As you can see, we have a parent component here, which renders the child component, and then the child component contains these elements, right? What we're going to do is we're going to head over to our app, and as you can see, we are rendering the parent component. What we're going to do this time is to use hello world and the parent component as two separate components using Vue Router. So first, in order to install Vue Router in our app, we need to create a folder. Let's name it as routes. And then we add a file here, which is named as index.js. Next, what we're going to do is somewhat similar to the Vuex store. So we're going to import Vue, and then we're going to import Vue Router. And then once we import it, we're going to tell Vuex, we're going to tell Vue to use Vue Router. Next, we're going to declare our routes using this syntax right. Have an empty array. For now, we don't have routes. Next, we need to declare a router, like so. Next, we need to attach our routes to it. Now we have a router which contains these routes. Next, we need to export this. Rather, we're going to export our router. Now that we have exported our router, we need to attach it to our main JS, which is right here. So we're going to import our router. Going to grab the routes, index.js, and then we're going to attach our router here. So now you can see that store and our router are existing on the same ecosystem. Now, how do we check if our Vue router is indeed installed? If it works as expected, you will see our same page right here. Next, we will add our routes. So how do we do that? First, we need to head over here and then we create an object. First parameter would be the path, which is the actual route. So let's use slash and then we declare a component to it. Now, what component are we going to use? Let's use hello world. So let's import this component right here, which is hello world, this one, and then use it as a component here. So if we click save, we now register one path. But as you can see, nothing happened, right? First, in order to make it appear, we need to declare a router view. Once we hit save, our component then appears. Since we don't need our parent component anymore here, let's remove it for now. So let's remove it. So now we have just a simple app with a router view right here. Next, we need to show our parent component as well. So in order to do that, we need to create another path, which means let's attach a parent here. So component, we attach our parent component here. So with that, grab this one and then add here. And now you have two routes. Now, how do we access this route? We simply type in our URL parent. As you can see, our view has changed. Now, once I remove the parent here, we're back to our hello world component. That is Vue Router. It allows you to change components using URLs. As you can see, if I type parent here, we go to our parent component. If I remove the parent here, we go to our hello world component. That's what Vue Router does. It allows you to change components based on routes, or rather URL links. Now, how do we change our routes within the app itself? For static routing, we use router link. And then we attach a to. Rather, this to is an object. And then we declare a path. And then, like we said in the presentation earlier, we declare what path it must go to. Now that we have that router link, we need to attach a simple text to it. And as you can see, we have a URL right here. Make things more neat, let's move it inside a container, which is a div. You can see it's below. Next, we need to create a link for our parent component. Let's copy that. And then let's attach the parent URL. And then let's rename this to parent. So now we have two links. So if I click on home, I get redirected to our hello world. But if I click parent, I get redirected to our parent component, which renders our child component right here. If I add something here, like so, if I head over to home, the hello world goes back. And if I click parent again, as you can see, the something is still there. Why is that so? That is the most essence of Vuex. As you have noticed, we can change components anytime. If our data is bound to the component, the moment we change our route here and then go back, the data should be gone, right? But in this case, since our state is persisted, whenever we change components, the data never changes. The only way it will change is if we refresh the page, meaning the state reinitializes again. You can see it's gone. So let's put it back. It's there, and then let's add something, rather nothing. There are 4 items. So now if I head back to my home component, which is hello world, you can see this. You can see our hello world component, right? But if I head over to parent, you can see that the state is still the same. That is what powers single page applications in Vue Js. By combining Vue Router and Vuex, you are able to create applications that can change components as well as persist their state. Now, let's go over to dynamic routing. So in order for that to work, we need to add a dynamic bind here. Let's duplicate this one, or rather, let's attach something to it. Let's say ID. Now, when we render a parent component, as you can see, nothing is rendered, right? That's because we're expecting an ID. If we attach something to it, renders, right? So in order to fetch this value, we go to our parent component and then let's display it. Let's use the route and params and then the value, which is ID. Let's paste it there. As you can see, it was able to fetch value here. If I change this to something, changes as well. So in this context, you are able to change, or rather you are able to transfer values between routes. If I click this, we're back to our home component. But if I click this, we're down to nothing because our link here, which is parent, is not declared here as a route. But attach another element here, say element, it's rendered because the path is declared here. Also, you will notice this ID. What this means is that whatever value we add here is passed to this path as a parameter. Meaning, once we head over to the component, which is this one, we can use that parameter as a value. Hence, it renders the value in our component. Now, how do we programmatically navigate in a way that it doesn't need a user interaction? In this case, we can create something called programmatic navigation. Rather than using router.link, we can use a button. So let's attach a button around here. Let's create a button and then a click event. Let's attach a go back method to it. So go back, go home. Let's change this to go home. Next, we'll create a method which is similar to this one. Now, what we're going to do is, if the user clicks this button, it's going to be redirected back to the mainland, which is the home component. So how do we do that? Basically, we call our router and then activate the push method. What we're going to push is a specific path, which is home path. So once we click this, we should be redirected to our home component. So let's try refreshing that. There you go. So as you can see, we used a method to redirect ourselves back to this path. So you can imagine that this router.push is a function called later on, wherein stuff happens here, and then that's when the push gets triggered. So that allows you to programmatically navigate your way between components without user interaction, or rather without using the router link, which is this element right here. So it allows you some form of flexibility between navigating components. So with all that said, you can now create your own single page application using Vuex and Vue Router as well as components. By combining them all together, you can create single page applications, whether it be small, large, or rather it can be an enterprise level single page applications. With these three tools, you can create all sorts of these apps. Rather, you can create whatever your mind can imagine. So that's it for today. Thank you for watching.